Thank you all for joining us. This is Prospect Live, a global warning panel event. My name is David Dayen. I'm the executive editor of the American Prospect. We have a really good panel for you today. And this is happening, of course, in the wake of the COP26 talks, which I heard best described as a climate change themed cocktail party that was held in Glasgow, Scotland, which came up with an agreement that I think, depending on your perspective, you were either relieved that there was an agreement at all, or maybe disappointed by the substance. There's certainly a lot to talk about with respect to not only what happened in Glasgow, but the impact of the climate and global climate talks and the main issues that were discussed there. So we have at the Prospect been doing a series since October, actually, about not just COP26, but the lead up to it and the main issues involved in getting the entire world together to try to figure out how to deal with the climate crisis. We've had two people who have really anchored our coverage on that. That's our senior editor, Gabrielle Gurley, and our writing fellow, Lee Harris. And I'm fortunate in that I'm going to turn it over to them for this event, which I'm really excited about. So I want to start with Gabrielle. And Gabrielle, you can introduce your panelists, and then after that, Lee will also have a conversation as well that she can introduce. So without further ado, take it away, Gabrielle.
Thank you, David. Nuclear power and COP26 is our charge in this segment. And as our audience can imagine, nuclear power was controversial going into COP26, and coming out of COP26, that did not change. If anything, countries held firm to their pro or anti-nuclear stances. So joining me today to talk about nuclear power, COP26, and on the way forward are Kenneth Luongo, the president of the Partnership for Global Security, and Stephen Nesbit, president of the American Nuclear Society. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks.
So nuclear, it seems, was relegated to almost observer status with no agreements or pledges coming out of the conference. So I was wondering if you could both summarize from your point of view where nuclear was at all in the discussions at the conference. Ken, I'm going to go with you first.
Well, it wasn't in the green zone, that's for sure. It wasn't in the agreement. It wasn't central to the diplomatic negotiations, but I actually think that nuclear had a good COP in the sense that there was a very significant shift in elite opinion on the role of nuclear energy as a contributor to zero carbon. So there were articles, your article, Gabrielle, which really teed the issue up very well. There were a piece in The Economist. There were two pieces in the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal, all of which, and then obviously three pieces that were in the Foreign Affairs about the role of nuclear and climate. So I think that the nuclear conversation was definitely part of the discussion in Glasgow, but it wasn't centered. But that being said, I think that the perception of nuclear as a backbone for zero carbon, I think that debate has changed significantly at the opinion maker level.
Okay, so Steve, you had some of American Nuclear Society affiliates at the conference. What did they hear from policymakers and politicians about nuclear?
Quite a bit, and not only, it's not just what they heard, but what they said. They we had a group of folks from the Young Generation Network in the UK and other countries, and of course the United States, representing our interests there at COP, and they were very active in terms of getting the word out about the role of nuclear energy in the clean energy future that we all have. They spoke with some ministers from Germany and questioned, just exactly why are you going to be paying people in Africa to switch from coal to solar, and you're generating more emissions because you had to increase your coal generation when you shut down your nuclear plants and things like that. They even spoke with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez briefly at the conference. As you can imagine, as I understand it, there were quite a lot of people, notables running around, and she was very gracious in her recognition of the ANS there. So, I think I just want to say that I agree wholeheartedly with what Ken had to say about sort of nuclear's outcome from COP. It was, if you compare it back to COP21 in Paris, it was a whole different ballgame. I think there's a wider and a deeper recognition of the value of nuclear energy, and the fact that looking to the future, nuclear power is really an enabler for renewable energy and all sorts of energy options there. So you need the firm, reliable sources as well as the renewable ones.
Well, the views on nuclear power have shifted dramatically since Fukushima. That played out at COP. And also the current energy crisis in Europe has played a significant role in kind of honing people's or countries' positions. But one of the interesting things that came out of the conference was this creation of an anti-nuclear bloc. And you mentioned Germany, who has now been joined by Austria, Denmark, Luxembourg, and Portugal as the folks in the European Union who are not happy with this, what they see as a shift, or I don't want to say renunciation, but a shift in a more determined fashion towards nuclear energy, led by the French, led by some of the Eastern European countries. What do you make of the hardening, particularly in Germany, that hasn't really wavered since Fukushima on their opposition to nuclear going forward?
Well, to be honest, I don't think it's hardening. I think it's just it just kind of looks that way because I think the attitudes of a lot of other countries has softened, if you will. So it's all relative, right? The Germans are hard over against nuclear energy, and it's become ingrained in their national psyche, and I don't think that's going to change. And the big issue there, of course, is the European Union taxonomy, or the treatment for support for clean energy sources. But I think most people recognize that you have to at some point make a decision. Do you really think climate change is an existential threat to humans on this earth? And if it is, then you need to use all the tools in your toolbox to address it. I think that this sort of picking and choosing, well, we're against climate, we're against greenhouse gas emissions, except it's okay if we're using them to make up for shutting down nuclear plants. I think that's just so logically flawed that most entities and most people recognize that. You can't force people to see it your way, but that's what we're seeing, in the U.S. and abroad as the support for nuclear energy has increased since the down days of Fukushima, if you will.
Ken, can you talk a little bit about Germany? I mean, they are not giving way on it. I mean, they're very concerned about waste, nuclear waste, and some of the many, what they see as the downsides of nuclear energy. How do you get the countries that have these concerns and are also have concerns about the climate crisis to reverse their views, or do they? Particularly since you've got some countries, you've got newcomers like Turkey and Bangladesh and the UAE who are basically, okay, we're new to this club and we're just going to plow on ahead.
I thought what Steve was going to say was that you couldn't get any harder over in Germany against nuclear power, which is what I think the case is. I think it's just so ingrained politically, and then I think that the German taxpayers have spent so much money on wind and solar. They have the highest energy prices in Europe. So they've dug a hole. It's deep, and I think they're continuing to dig. That being the case, there has been some pushback on the German government. I don't think it's going to be very effective. I do think that the European Union, this taxonomy issue, which is a very technical term for whether or not you get favored treatment financially for your zero carbon, I do think that the EU leadership is leaning in the direction of including nuclear power and maybe even natural gas as a bridge fuel. But to your point, I think that the political force in Europe has shifted from the West to the East. You've got heavily dependent coal countries like Poland and the Czech Republic and Romania and others. And if you're going to make this commitment to zero carbon or net zero carbon by whatever the date is, 2050 or whatever, you're going to need a backbone of zero carbon electricity. And, wind and solar is just not going to do it for those countries, just like South Korea and Japan have reversed their position to some degree on renewables. I mean, the Japanese plan for zero carbon relied heavily on offshore wind, as did South Korea. The pushback politically on both of those issues, plus the lack of wind power off the UK shore that is creating or contributing to the European energy crisis, I think is making everyone think twice about what the mix of energy sources ought to be. And you only have three choices. You have hydro, you have some form of fossil, or you have nuclear as your baseload capacity to make sure that your economy grows. The other thing I would say, Gabrielle, is there's also this kind of subtle pushback coming from the developing economy world. Mm-hmm. The president of Uganda wrote an op-ed in an American newspaper that said, don't consign us to the, to wind and solar only. We have a growing population, we have increasing energy demand, increasing urbanization. All of those things are driving the need for more reliable power. They're interested in nuclear and they're interested in renewables. And to Steve's point, this is a synergistic issue. This is not an either or, and I think playing one against the other doesn't work. This is a synergistic process where we need wind and solar, but we also need some zero carbon backbone that is going to be on all the time. I mean, that is an economic essential requirement.
And of course, the game changer, which has not happened yet on the renewables front, is energy storage. That is battery storage for the energy that is produced by wind and solar. And at such time, obviously, that's being worked on, particularly in California. Until that transition happens, we are kind of at a loss, if you will, in incorporating the storage question on renewables, which obviously is not something that we have with an energy source like nuclear. Let's transition now to some of the technical considerations and with the next generation of nuclear plants. Conventional plants, I think it is agree, will continue to be, will take long to come to market and will be tremendously expensive. All you have to do is look at what's going on in Georgia with the increasing price tag for a conventional plant there in the tens of billions of dollars. Next up, are small modular reactors, and is wondering, perhaps, Steve, if you could give us the layman's picture of what a small modular nuclear reactor is, and what we're looking at in terms of cost, siting, and how it can complement renewables.
Well, thanks, Gabrielle. I'll be glad to. So the whole idea of small modular reactors is to try to turn on its head the whole economy of scale argument that says bigger is better. So the idea with small modular reactors is that instead of building these very large plants of 1,000 megawatts or more, you would look at your electricity needs and you would build smaller plants, and the number of them that you need in order to get the demand, whether it's 200 megawatts, whether it's 500 megawatts, whether it's 1,000 megawatts, you just put more plants together. Well, how does this possibly have an advantage from an economies of scale perspective? There's a couple of reasons. So one of them is that you can build these things in factories rather than stick build them on the ground at a site and ship them to the site to a large extent and put them together as you need them. And we're thinking that that will be a major advantage from a cost control and predictability of schedule perspective if you can do it that way rather than being at the mercy of the larger project on the ground, out in the weather, et cetera. And the other thing is that the small modular reactors, because of their small size and other design attributes, are able to take advantage of what we call passive and inherent safety features. And that greatly reduces the complexity of the plant, the need for active systems in order to provide the appropriate measure of safety. So you end up with something, if everything works out right, that's not only cheaper, but safer in the long run.
Let's talk about some of those safety questions, because they come up again and again and again. And Ken, I'm going to turn to you. The waste question is particularly daunting. I just looked over some news articles about the Pilgrim plant in outside of Boston, and they recently moved all the radioactive materials outside in canisters outside the plant. Now, if I am not a nuclear expert, but I am living near that plant, I'm a little bit concerned that the material that was inside the plant is now outside the plant. Given the world that we live in, the very dangerous world that we live in, what do you make of the problem of nuclear waste, particularly when plants are being decommissioned? There are issues of terrorism in the United States. That's both foreign and domestic. And obviously there are non-proliferation issues. Ken?
Right. Well, we don't have a national repository. That was supposed to be Yucca Mountain, and it's probably never going to be. So there's not going to be a central government repository for nuclear waste in the near term or in the medium term. So what reactor operators are doing is they take their fuel once it's out of the reactor and they put it in water in pools and cool it down. And when it's adequately cooled down, they take it and they put it in dry casks, where it sits on a platform very benignly, as long as it's not tampered with, and it's not really a threat to the community. And this is going on at reactors all around the country, of which we have, some 90 or so reactors, all mostly east of the Mississippi. So I think, the nuclear waste issue it's got a lot of threads that run through it. So from a domestic standpoint, it doesn't strike me that people are up in arms about the way that that nuclear waste at existing plants is being handled by the operators and by the utilities. In the foreign market, particularly in Asia, which doesn't have nearly, let's just take Japan and South Korea, which doesn't have the same land mass that the United States does. The issue of nuclear waste is more challenging, and it has become kind of a lightning rod for opposition to nuclear power in those countries. In South Korea, this is where the proliferation issue begins to interweave with this. In South Korea, they want to take the waste and treat it so that you reduce the volume, but in doing that, you expose some of the more weapon usable aspects, including the plutonium in the fuel, to potential, danger, as it were. In Japan, they take their spent fuel and they send it to France, which is reprocessing that spent fuel in volume for a number of different countries. So, the volume of reactor grade plutonium, which is just a different way of saying not 100% weapon grade, but also weapon usable, is something that people worry about. And I think it's something that people should worry about. But I also think that there's a lot of protective measures which are put in place. I don't condone the massive reprocessing of spent fuel for the extraction of the plutonium for potential weapons, a hedge or something like that. But in the United States, we don't do that. We absolutely do not reprocess the spent fuel from civil nuclear reactors at this time. And I don't foresee a time in the near future when we will do that. The next generation of reactors that you referenced and Steve referenced, when you get beyond the small modular version, which is kind of a scaled down light water reactor, to the advanced reactors, which don't run on on the same conventional fuel cycle that you have in large reactors, those reactors can run for a longer period of time on the same fuel load, or there are different ways to manage those. There's lots of different designs out there, so I don't want to talk about them in detail. I would just say that certainly nuclear waste is a concern of the public. It should be a concern of the public. I don't see it in the United States as being a wedge issue politically or in terms of support for the technology at the moment.
So Steve, let me ask you about community opposition or community fears about nuclear. I know we talked a little bit about Yucca Mountain, and you mentioned that communities where the community where Yucca Mountain is located, they were supportive, but what one sees when people look at these various communities is a lot of resignation. The plan is there. For example, the plants that I'm personally familiar with in New England, the plants are there. There's nothing they can do about it. And if there's an accident, well, everyone, people are going to go to the fridge and get their ice cream, and, whatever happens. And I don't know if we should take resignation as a, signal that communities are okay with nuclear plants.
Yeah, I think that it's a tough issue because you want there to be a solution, and there's not a neat and easy solution right now. We thought we had a neat and easy solution with Yucca Mountain, and that got sideways politically. And as Ken points out, that's probably not going to happen. But I'll just say, as far as community acceptance is concerned, so I used to work for a large nuclear utility in the Southeast, and we had great relationships with our communities in North and South Carolina. And the communities were very supportive of our plants. Of course, the people that worked at the plants were in the community. So it was kind of a symbiotic relationship. If you look at even waste facilities, typically the local communities are supportive, but where the problem breaks down is when you get to the states. If you look overseas, which is always interesting, the countries that are having more success in the US dealing with waste are those that don't have states, like Finland, like Sweden, So I think we're going to get there. What we've got right now, the good news is, so I'm a glass half full kind of guy, right? The good news is the nuclear power industry has safely stored its nuclear waste since the beginning of the nuclear power, in the United States in 1957. And we've done a lot of things like transport it from one site to another. It's all been done very safely. All the studies have indicated that that's the case. We can continue to do this for a long period of time. Do we want to keep the status quo forever? No, we want to go to places like Pilgrim and take their used fuel away. It's much less radioactive than it was when it was discharged from the reactor, but they didn't make the bargain of keeping that stuff around for years and years. So the country needs to get its act together, and I'm confident that we will. It's just not going to be in the next year or two, but in the meantime, we will be able to safely maintain the material.
There are concerns about jobs, and obviously the people who benefit from the jobs and the money that goes into the coffers that host these communities are certainly something that are benefits. However, and I'm just going to bring us back around because these are the questions that I get as a reporter. What about issues like terrorism that are, at the front of everyone's consciousness these days in the U.S., be it foreign or domestic? I mean, how certain can we be that the highest measures are taken at these plants in light of something like the insurrection, when people see a government building that everyone thought was at least physically impenetrable goes by the wayside? Well, what is your sense of the security features that are going to deter bad actors?
I know Ken's going to want to say something about this, but let me just say real quickly, as a former, person who worked at a nuclear utility, the material is very, very strongly secured, protected, and guarded. And the very nature of it, the fact that it doesn't require active cooling or anything like that, the used fuel is inside of welded steel canisters that are inside of very heavy concrete overpacks that are designed to protect the material against all sorts of flying cars and missiles and things of that nature. It's just a very hard target to begin with. And from that perspective, I think that, if I was a terrorist and I was looking for some way to cause harm to a lot of people, there's a lot of easier ways to do it than to try to take on a nuclear power plant or used fuel storage facility. I'll let Ken chime in.
Yeah, I mean, it's easier to cause panic and terrorism by taking a highly radioactive source that's used in medical applications or industrial applications and wrap an explosive around it and contaminate, a downtown of a large city that would put the country back on its heels. That's a very real possibility that the government guards against, as it does against the terrorist exploitation of or active or spent fuel. So in the wake of 9/11, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission went in and redid their requirements for nuclear security and strengthened them. And I believe the industry was completely on board with the decision to do that, because nobody, the point is that an accident impacts the ability of this entire industry to produce the zero carbon energy which is required. I mean, this is a very circular kind of an issue. You can't say, oh, I don't care about nonproliferation or terrorism, I care about zero carbon, because the two issues are welded together and you can't separate one from the other. If you're going to have these plants, they have to be safe and secure. You have to take extraordinary measures. There are people, I would say, Gabrielle, I have seen photos, I haven't ever seen it in person, with very large guns. And our approach in the United States is very much focused on what's called guards, guns, and gates, which is, defense in depth and people with weapons to defend the facilities. I think there is with the advent of artificial intelligence and other sensor technologies, there's a move toward using that as part of the defense process as well. But other countries do it differently. Again, just to reference Asia, which is much less of a gun culture than in the United States, they do not do it that way. They rely on local police force or guard force. If there's an incident, that being said, they have fewer, I would say, insurrection type problems than the United States has had in the last year.
So we're coming to the end of our half hour, and I just wanted to turn in the remaining time to the timeline issues, the research and development issues and the marketplace. Some people say there's such a long windup to having any of these plants online that they're really not going to be well situated to deal with the march towards zero emissions. So perhaps to sum up, where do you see these next generation facilities in that kind of race to net zero and 2030 and beyond?
Well, we've got a couple of demonstration projects cooperatively funded by the Department of Energy and private industry that are scheduled to begin operation in 2027. Now, there's also small modular reactors like the NuScale reactor that have had a design certified by the NRC and are ready to get going. So, you know, in my optimistic glass half full, maybe 3/4 full perspective, we're going to have new innovative technologies coming online before the end of this decade to help us reach our clean energy future.
So Ken, are you as optimistic as Steve?
I am very hard-nosed about this. This is a cannot fail process. Because if you fail, there is no plan B, okay? I mean, if you fail in the United States and in other Western countries in the development of this technology, you will be giving the entire global nuclear market to two authoritarian countries, Russia and China. And that is a huge geopolitical challenge to the United States. So I think you can't fail.
Okay, well, we will leave it there. And Steve Nesbit, Ken Luongo, thank you very much for being with us this evening.
Thank you, Gabrielle.
Thank you.
Next up is Lee Harris and her guest, Anusar Farooqui. Thanks very much, gentlemen. Lee, over to you.
Gabrielle, that was super interesting. So we're going to switch gears a bit and talk about another big topic of discussion at the UN Climate Summit, which was finance. And I think that feels really new because, I mean, for a while now, people have understood that global warming is going to be costly. You have to hunker down to prepare for rising seas and blackouts and the destabilizing political effects of environmental shocks. And that's all expensive even before you factor in a big future shock to the financial system where investors suddenly reckon with the credit risk on their books threatened by a climate catastrophe. But increasingly when we're talking about climate, we're kind of encouraged to think about something else, which is the energy transition and everything we need to build and manufacture, power plants and public housing and installing solar panels and subway systems. And it's not, by the way, it's not just infrastructure, obviously, that needs to be greened, it's also stuff. So pick any item in the supply shock that we've been experiencing and it probably needs to be greened: Christmas toys, soybeans, cargo ships, and the fuel that they run on. So I invited Anusar Farooqui, who's a political analyst who thinks both about that price tag and then also about the political costs of the energy transition in really interesting, sort of provocative ways. He blogs at Policy Tensor. And I think his work there is interesting because he argues that, and tell me if this is wrong, Anusar, but basically that even in rich social democracies, it won't be possible to fund the energy transition purely from public balance sheets. We're going to need governments to induce private sector investment in manufacturing the weaponry of the green transition, high voltage transmission lines and EV factories instead of guns and tanks. And Anusar, we saw a lot of talk about green investment at COP26, which ended last Friday. And in fact, the business press says private investment's already kicking off with ESG investment funds, albeit, you know, in this kind of ad hoc, uncoordinated way. ESG, by the way, stands for environmental, social, and corporate governance. And there have been all these new offerings marketed as more environmentally friendly ways to invest. But major critics have emerged, including from within the sector itself. And most prominently, Tariq Fancy, who was previously the head of sustainable investing at BlackRock, the asset manager. He says it's basically all a sham, and it served as more of a distraction than as a real tool for kicking off green investment. So I wonder, maybe we could start there and you could tell me how ESG funds attempt to spur investment in climate-friendly projects and where you think they might be falling short.
So I think Tariq Fancy is very, very important, right? In the sense that he really is like a true whistleblower. So this guy comes from the very heart of the beast. He was the head of sustainable investing at BlackRock, the largest asset manager in the world, which has made a big deal out of ESG. And what they are saying is, listen, being good corporate citizens is good for the bottom line, right? And so ESG metrics, ESG funds are not only good, are actually good for investors, and they will help the world transition, and we will shepherd the private sector, private finance will shepherd the transition. And Tariq Fancy says that is not going to happen. And that is just simply shenanigans. It's wool over your eyes. It's mostly sham. So many funds are actually outright bogus. So many ESG funds have, for example, oil and gas companies on their portfolios. But that's not the real problem, I think, with ESG. The real problem with ESG is that the main metrics that we have from the big ESG providers, it's now a competitive space, but there's still a dominant 2 or 3 providers, MSCI, Sustainalytics, and the big users, which are these giant asset managers. And what they're doing is they're not measuring exactly what you think that what you think they're measuring, which is that is the company a good corporate citizen? That should be high scores, right? Or is the company a green company or a brown company? And that should correlate with the scores. That's not what they're measuring. What they're measuring is the risk to financial performance of the company from regulatory changes coming their way in these spaces, right? And so especially in an environment, what they're measuring is how much is the company's profitability at risk from upcoming regulation, and that's a real problem. So Tim and I had Tim Sahai, who is with the Green New Deal Network. In joint work with him, we had proposed a ratings agency by the government to be formed. That Congress should form a ratings agency to replace these shenanigans, so that all economic actors in the system can tell green assets from brown, because right now that's not possible because of the proliferation of arbitrary standards.
But it's so just to pause for a second before we go to your green ratings agency idea, which is fascinating. So it sounds like there are 2 separate problems. One is standardization of just like, what does it actually mean to slap an ESG label on something? Does it mean totally different things at different companies? And clearly, as of right now, it does. If some ESG rated companies or people who are claiming that label have oil and gas on their books. But then there's this separate question of not of standardization and transparency of metrics, but actually just like what is ESG measuring? Is it referring directly to how bad something is for the planet, or is it referring to how much risk is incurred by doing environmentally unfriendly action? How much regulatory risk? And if it's the latter, if it's about regulatory risk, then companies don't have anything to worry about if governments never regulate them.
Exactly. So if government regulation is kind of ruled out because, let's say, the GOP gets back in power in 2022, then ESG risk will decline. So the ESG premium will vanish. This idea that ESG is kind of like a silver bullet is what Fancy is saying is that it's completely nonsense. Like that cannot work at all. Governments need to set the stage, set the playing field, so that private sectors have the right incentives. So the big idea that Tariq Fancy and other extremely well-informed people have about what should be done is carbon pricing. But that is also mistaken, I believe. But that the reason why carbon pricing is mistaken is because of political economy, not because it wouldn't work in theory. So it's like this technocratic fallacy that if you just set the prices right, the price signals right, then all actors will adapt, except that nobody has a political coalition to push through a global carbon pricing regime, which is like a market disciplinary regime, sort of like the euro, which is a project by European technocratic elites to impose a kind of abstract formal order on the European economic space without thinking through the ramifications, the political ramifications downstream.
Wait, so just to sum up so far, the issue with a lot of the mainstream thinking about ESG is, well, if governments are going to use regulations and laws to rule out polluter behavior, then being a polluter is much less profitable. So we should disinvest proactively from those industries. But if that fundamental assumption that governments are actually going to regulate away carbon intensive activities, if that is a faulty assumption, as it might be, then even a kind of rigorously standardized ESG won't actually get you the kind of decarbonization you need. So
actually, can I push back a little bit against that? So if you have a good signal of what is green and what is not, right? Then all the money flowing into sustainable funds, which is a very large amount of money. Now there's $1.7 trillion that is by the end of 2020. The Financial Times reported a few months ago. By the end of 2020, $1.7 trillion had flown into sustainable funds. And that kind of money can go towards funding green projects if you can tell green from brown, right? And so it's very important to get that distinction right. So measurement is not a trivial, a secondary issue at all. It's a very important issue. The role that finance can play, it can only play if the information that it has is kosher. Just like you can only finance the right mortgages if you know which is prime and which is not which is subprime.
What do you make of the argument that all of that money flowing into ESG funds is basically just a bubble? I mean, after all, we're in a really low rate environment. There's a search for returns. I mean, NFTs, which are those online tokens where it's essentially a picture of an object can be sold and you have the rights to it. NFTs have garnered $10 billion in trading volume just in the third quarter of 2021. So right now is the time when people are pouring money into all kinds of crazy stuff. What should make me think that ESG investment boom isn't just a bubble?
I think that you need to keep in mind the kind of intellectual revolution that is happening in the professional class across the board, right? So people are actually...
Wait, slow down. Intellectual revolution in the professional class. So break down for me what you're talking about.
So think about just how much the conversations change around climate and racial politics and all sorts of issues. Like it's just, in the past 5-6 years, we've seen a dramatic change. And that dramatic change is kind of, called the Great Awakening and whatnot. But it is real, right? And people are, the reason why it is happening and it's not going to fold back the reason why it's not a fad is because what Tim calls the climate stick is going to keep whacking you, right? So it gets worse from here, and the risk is only going to escalate. And the more feedback you get from the planet, the greater the panic, right? So we can expect this kind of environmental radicalism and the politics of climate change is kind of becoming central to global political economy everywhere.
Spell out for me what you think that looks like in the EU, because there's lots of talk of implementing carbon pricing in the EU right now, right? Which is, the US is really far out from that and may never get there. What do you think a regime of, as you put it, implementing carbon pricing at the pump would do in practice to EU politics?
So I think that it's going to destroy the legitimacy of the parties that try to implement it. So the class partisan coalitions that oversee this implementation will face dramatic pushback, and the Yellow Vest movement was just a taster, appetizer of things to come, right? What you have is very large, very dominant social classes of suburban middle class and working class people who rely very in a way that the dominant elites don't realize. Their reliance on the fossil fuel way of life is so complete that they would have to pay a very heavy price for this thing to be actually done through the price mechanism. So if the price mechanism is to work, the price of everything that costs, that is dirty, has to go up really by a lot, right? And that is a very large part of the consumption bundle of the working classes and the middle classes. You can't actually impose that price on them. If you try to impose that price on them, you'll get thrown out of power. And that's what's going to happen to social democratic parties across Europe, is my wager.
So in other words, the only carbon pricing scenarios you see are carbon gets underpriced, in which case there's no climate solution and you probably still annoy people, or carbon is accurately priced, in which you get huge political upheaval and backlash.
Exactly. So this is the reason why this is so annoying to me, is that there is an alternative which is like so much more palatable, so much more politically feasible, which is that you just directly finance the transition, right? You put in the electric charging station, you pay people to cash for clunkers, as Sanders said, right? And you do the transition directly without trying to impose a market discipline regime on normal people. You want to do carbon pricing, you can do that at the industry level. You can do that at the level of the financial sector. You can't do that at the level of everyday people and expect that to go through. It's not going to happen.
Right, but I guess the question becomes, who pays for it, and to what extent you're blending, in the new popular term, private and public investment sources. And one thing that seems to compound the class politics problem of all of this that I hope you'll talk about is new calls from the developing world and from emerging markets for the climate transition to be funded there as well. And it seems to me like there's a real framing problem in that debate where there's been a lot of talk, for example, about this $100 billion climate fund. And in a lot of the kind of business press reporting on it, it's described as a kind of charity fund. Rich countries put in money and poor countries draw on it, like, like a World Bank or another multilateral institution, but even more like a philanthropic effort or something. Tell me why that's wrong, and kind of tell me a little bit about the kind of investment opportunity of blended finance, which has been sort of widely criticized, and also how it could go wrong.
Lee, we've talked about Daniela Gabor's idea of the Wall Street consensus. Let's bring that in. So the multilateral financial institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, the International Development Funds, and so on, and they have this idea that, okay, the developing countries face very high borrowing costs, which means that their financing costs for implementing, let's say, large-scale solar or smart grids or hydro or wind and so on is very high, right? So the same project costs 50% more in a place like Indonesia or India than it does in the United States or Germany. And the reason why it costs more is because the investment is riskier. You demand a higher risk premium to fund that investment, right? So the idea that the international financial institutions have come up with is that you remove some of that risk, including especially currency risk, and that this is the best use of third world fiscal capacity, which is very limited, right? So the critique that Daniela Gabor and others have made is that most of this has been tried and most of it has failed, right? And we know that she's right? Things like this that have been tried, public-private partnerships, have generally been captured by crony capitalist interests in the third world, and they have failed, right? But this problem of generalized institutional incompetence in the third world is the problem of modernization, right? It's not going to go away. It is intrinsically tied to the problem of the energy transition. You cannot separate them. The developing countries, which are desperate to modernize, are not going to sacrifice their modernization goals for the energy transition, right? So this was made very dramatically obvious by, I think, India's sort of stunning number in Glasgow, right? Which is, they're like, you want us to do this coal transition? It's going to cost $1 trillion, right, over the next 10 years. Which is, so if you add up the $100 billion a year that the rich countries have promised, that adds up to the entire budget goes to India, right? Forget about the 170 countries in the global South. So it's, and that's the real challenge of the global transition, which is that you have very limited fiscal capacity which is really concrete, right? In a way that countries in the third world are constrained in ways that countries in the global north are not, right? So for example, the United States can borrow arbitrary amounts of money. It's not going to change its borrowing rate. But that's not true of Turkey. That's not true of India. That's not true of Indonesia.
There's something cynical, though, surely, about framing the problem as one of limited fiscal capacity and the expensiveness of credit to these countries, when it's both multilateral institutions and the major asset managers who make credit conditions so punitive to begin with. I mean, combined and uneven development implies that these countries are going to be at a structural disadvantage even if they manage their books well.
Right, right. So this is the problem of the.
I'm just trying to say that that these kind of private players who have not invested in developing markets for 30 years at the necessary pace are swooping in to say that they're going to relax or that, you know, with government subsidies, they're going to relax constraints on credit that they've imposed for the past several decades.
I don't think that this is a question of imposition. The structures of power embodied in global finance, in the sort of supremacy of Western financial institutions, and the sort of subjugation of third world sovereign borrowers and so on, and their disciplining by global bond markets, is not simply a question of the policy choices of Western financial institutions. It's a question of actual asymmetries of development, right? So it is actually risky to invest in a bond in a third world country, and that therefore that bond commands a risk premium over much less riskier investment destinations, right? So these structures of power are not going to vanish, right? The question is, how do we do the energy transition, given that the point of departure is this massively unequal system of the global financial order, right? And in that, if you take that realist position as the point of departure, then the question becomes, how do we finance the $131 trillion globally that is required to do the entire energy transition over the next 10, 20, 30 years?
Right. And so I want to put that question back to you and ask you to talk a bit about whether any progress was made towards that goal at COP. Because it seems to me like the problem is, even if you take the pragmatist or realist objection to the Wall Street consensus seriously, and you say, well, yeah, we don't love that BlackRock is our sort of like that we're being friends with the enemy and trying to attack this problem with blended finance and with asset managers making off with major profits, but we're willing to take that on board in order to achieve the energy transition at speed and scale. Even once you've adopted that stance, it's not at all clear what so-called de-risking paradigm or what regime of subsidies to asset managers and other investors would actually get BlackRock to start building solar farms in Indonesia. So what are the conditions required to set off the boom once you've taken on board the kind of realist objections?
So the real challenge here, so the technical problem is solved. The financial problem is kind of solved in the sense that there is enough capital to finance the transition, and capital is willing to fund the transition. The problem that needs to be solved is one of political will, and it's really a political coalition. How to build these political coalitions across places like India and Indonesia and China and the United States. It's a very difficult challenge because in each country, you have to kind of contain the fossil fuel interest, and then you have to build a coalition around seeing through a medium-term agenda, which needs a stable kind of political coalition, right? So think about coal, right? Coal is extremely hard for India to phase out of coal is extremely hard, right? Because so much is riding on it. Millions of people, the access to electricity for millions of people depends on India exploiting its coal, right? And unless you can come up with something and say, no, we're going to finance 10 nuclear reactors that is going to make coal uncompetitive in India and provide you with this, you can't do it. And that requires global cooperation. That requires financing deals. That requires public-private partnerships and all of the above solutions. And we haven't even gotten started. The COP26 agenda, the one thing that they were supposed to do at Glasgow was to get guarantees for coal, and they couldn't do it. And it's been a disaster. But
yeah,
I
on
think
that point, on the point about coal, can you talk a little bit about, as you and the analyst Tim Zahai have identified it, the gap between discourse and reality? I mean, coal is something that's already being phased out, and if COP is supposed to do anything, it's supposed to speed along kind of existing trends. You know, it's lagging far behind the the kind of abysmal progress that the private sector largely has been able to make on coal. It hasn't even touched on, for instance, oil and gas, which isn't mentioned in the agreement that came out of COP. I wonder, can you just react to the extent to which discourse at COP has lagged action, at least in the developed world?
So this is kind of in a sense, we don't. I've been reading the sort of news around this and the kind of editorial boards of the Financial Times and the New York Times and so on, that sort of thing. And the thing I'm seeing is, when some progress was made and so on, and it's okay. At least it's not terrible. But what do you mean by that? We are, even the pledges that have been made, and there are no guarantees that these pledges will be delivered on, right? Even the pledges that we have don't get us anywhere close to ruling out even the extreme scenarios, right? So each degree of warming is a 7-fold increase in extreme climate-related events, and this is a unfolding disaster whose makings have to do with the specifics of our historical conjuncture, right? There is a reason why the left is locked out of power everywhere, and there's a reason why the climate politics is kind of locked in the left, and the right wing is kind of allied to fossil interests. This global alignment, you see this across the board, right? Why do you see this global alignment across the board? I think that's a very interesting question that we cannot answer without really talking about the class politics of this transition.
Actually, maybe the way to answer it is to point to the maybe the exception is proved, the rule is proved by the exception or something, and we should think about Texas and red states that have been way better on energy transition, on building solar and wind, and on building green housing, and then it almost seems like as soon as that becomes a politically internalized, registered fact, there's a backlash to it. But yeah, why speculate with me? Like, why does energy transition stuff get coded as green, as left wing? And are there other counterexamples you can think of?
It's sort of historical co-movement, right? In the sense that some things get folded into some kind of political affinities between certain ideas. And I don't want to exaggerate at this point, but it seems to me that what's happening in the United States is kind of like a microcosm of what's happening globally in terms of the class politics of this, in terms of the failures of the progressive left on this, in terms of who's demanding what and what the nature of the pushback, what the sort of pushback that is happening in terms of kind of this denialism or this grandstanding that we'll just see it through, right? The solution is to build big walls to keep out the Central Americans, and then we'll be fine. And the Europeans can keep out the Africans, and they'll be fine. And this kind of walled world is the right answer. And adaptationism, a militarized adaptationism, is the right answer to the crisis.
So if the eco-fascist walled world is the world we're careening towards because of how, which political ideas are linked to a progressive left and its tactical failures. My question for you is, well, one really popular framing of the problem that's kind of discursively in vogue at things like COP is climate justice. Centering centered groups, indigeneity, local communities, this sort of thing. Do you think climate justice is a good framing for presenting something like Modi's $1 trillion pledge, or any other demands tied to climate for that matter? Or do you think it also leads to this kind of like walled world that you're
I think that's part of the blockage. So the kind of discourse that the woke left, the Verso left, is stuck inside, right? Is partly responsible for its self-isolation, for its isolation in the professional class, millennial social world, right? And it's contained in that world because of the discourse. And I think that the really, and this is starting to change, I think, because Jacobin just released a very interesting study of swing state voters, working class swing state voters, which shows that, this is just a terrible idea. The actual progressive ideals in a colorblind anti-racist way can really work. But if you try to spin it in terms of a theory seminar, that's not going to work. That's not going to work at all, because it's a discourse of class oppression. That's the issue. The issue is that when you throw around things like centering, that's just telling me you went to a top school and I didn't, and I don't accept that. And that's the sort of pushback that you get when you use the discourse, the social justice discourse, and that is really kind of the left has trapped itself in that corner. But I think that's starting to break out. This was that Jacobin published this is very interesting to me.
Why? Because you see them as an organ of the Verso left?
Oh, absolutely. What's more Verso left than Jacobin?
I don't think that's their self-understanding. They definitely call themselves class first leftists, as does half of the Verso crowd. But we can have that debate. Okay. Anusar, thank you so much for joining me. I do want to shout out Anusar's terrific blog where he writes about climate, but also all kinds of investment trends and political economy of carbon and more. And also where he writes with Albert Pinto, the pen name of Tim Sahai, who he mentioned, who can be followed on Twitter at 70s Bakchan. And both are really brilliant thinkers about political economy in Anusar's case, and climate inequality and development in Tim's. So thank you for coming, and more to
great to join you, Jay. Thanks. Bye.